Hal took a deep breath, feeling exhaustion seep into every cell of his body. An 8-hour shift, from answering phone calls, manning the cash register, to driving around town delivering orders, had left him drained. The town where Hal lived was now just a shadow of its former self, a place that had once been bustling with small shops and lush green farms, now reduced to abandoned buildings and desolate streets. Hal had no choice but to stay here. The only place that still held a faint breath of life was the small pizza shop where he worked under Tony, a boss who was both rigid and irritable. Hal had once dreamed of a different life, somewhere far from this dying town, but everything changed when his mother fell ill. He and his fiancée, Rita, decided to return to their hometown to care for her, and this pizza delivery job was the only option that allowed him to pay rent for the tiny apartment on the second floor of an old hardware store. Hal's life was a monotonous cycle, and with each passing day he felt more trapped in an inescapable loop. Tonight, Hal had hoped to get home early. He had cleaned the counter, locked the doors, and was about to head to the break room to clock out. His mind had already drifted to the small apartment where Rita was waiting with a warm dinner and her gentle embrace. But everything changed when Tony's voice rang out from the cash register. "Hal, hold on a minute, I just got a call for an order." Hal stopped in his tracks, a wave of frustration and disappointment rising within him. He turned back, looking at Tony with pleading eyes. "Tony, I've already cleaned up. We're closed and I really don't want to work overtime." Tony, with his stocky figure and stern face, pointed at the clock on the wall. "We still have 5 minutes before we officially close, Hal. And you know the store policy. Even if there's just 1 minute left before closing, if there's an order, we serve it. That's been my family's tradition since this shop opened 70 years ago, and I'm not about to break it." Hal sighed, a sense of helplessness washing over him. He knew Tony wouldn't budge, and with his tight financial situation, he couldn't afford to turn down a chance to earn extra tips. "All right," Hal muttered, his voice filled with resignation. He walked over to the counter and took the address from Tony's hand. But as he looked at the piece of paper, a strange feeling swept over him. The address was completely unfamiliar, a place he had never heard of in all his years living in this town. "Where is this?" Hal asked, his eyes filled with doubt. Tony just shrugged. "Probably a new residential area that's been built. Just follow the directions and you'll find it." Hal glanced out the window, where the cold rain was pouring relentlessly. A vague sense of unease crept over him, but he had no other choice. With a heavy heart, he put on his jacket, grabbed the pizza box, and stepped out into the dark, gloomy night. He had no idea that this delivery would change his life forever. Hal stood frozen at the counter, his eyes filled with exhaustion and frustration, as he looked at Tony, his boss, who stood there with a stern expression, as if he had just issued an unchallengeable command. Outside, the heavy rain continued to pour relentlessly, cold droplets striking the store's glass windows like silent warnings of a long and uncertain night ahead. Hal sighed, trying to keep calm, but the fatigue from his long shift and the thought of having to deliver yet another order made it impossible to hide his annoyance. "Tony, I've already locked the door," Hal said, his tone tinged with a hint of pleading. "I've cleaned everything up and everything is ready to close. We're past working hours. I really don't want to do overtime anymore." He pointed to the clock on the wall, its hour hand nearing 10, the official closing time of the store. Tony smirked, his sharp gaze seeming to pierce through Hal's thoughts. "Hal, you know the store's rules," he said, his tone both firm and commanding. Tony gestured toward the large sign hanging on the wall behind the cash register, where bold, large font letters read, "Even if there's just 1 minute before closing, if there's an order, we serve it. This is my family's tradition. Tony continued, his voice lowering as if recounting something sacred. Since my father opened this store 70 years ago, we've always upheld that philosophy. No one gets turned away, no matter the time. Hal felt a chill run down his spine, not because of Tony's words, but because of how he emphasized tradition and philosophy. It wasn't just a business rule. To Tony, it seemed like an oath, something inviolable. Hal couldn't understand why his boss was so stubborn about this, but he knew he had no other choice. Tony, I really don't want to do this. Hal tried one last time to resist, his voice filled with disappointment. But Tony simply shrugged, his expression unchanged. Listen, Hal, he said, his tone suddenly softer but still authoritative. This customer said they'd give you a generous tip. I think you'll need it, won't you? Hal gritted his teeth, a wave of helplessness washing over him. Tony knew all too well about his financial struggles, knew that he couldn't afford to turn down any opportunity to earn extra money. That was how Tony always kept Hal under his control, pushing him to work more, longer, just to scrape together a few extra dollars. Hal felt anger rising within him, but he also knew he couldn't win this argument. Fine, Hal muttered, his voice full of resignation. He stepped up to the counter and took the address from Tony's hand, but as he looked at the piece of paper, a strange feeling swept over him. The address was completely unfamiliar, a place he had never heard of in all his years living in this town. Where is this? Hal asked, his eyes filled with doubt. Tony simply shrugged, his expression indifferent. Probably a new residential area that's been built. Just follow the directions, and you'll find it. Hal glanced out the window, where the cold darkness and unrelenting rain seemed like a curtain hiding something ominous. He felt a vague sense of unease, but had no other choice. With a heavy heart, he put on his jacket, grabbed the pizza box, and stepped out into the gloomy night. He had no idea that this delivery would take him to a place he would never forget. Hal stared intently at the piece of paper with the address written on it, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. The writing on the paper looked hastily scrawled, the pen strokes faint, and the address was entirely unfamiliar. Number 13 Ashgrove Road, he murmured, trying to match it with the mental map of the town in his head. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't recall any road named Ashgrove in this small town. The town itself was old and dilapidated, every corner familiar to Hal, so why was there an address he had never heard of? Hal looked up, his gaze filled with doubt as he turned to Tony. Where is this? I've never heard of Ashgrove Road in this town. Tony, as usual, simply shrugged with an indifferent expression. Maybe it's a new residential area built by some real estate developers, he said, his tone unconcerned. You know, sometimes they buy up land on the outskirts, build a few houses, and give it a fancy name. Just follow the directions and you'll find it. But Tony's explanation did little to ease the unease growing inside Hal. This town had been in decline for too long. No developers would want to invest here, and the idea of a new residential area seemed absurd. Hal felt like something was off, but he had no way to confirm it. Outside, the rain grew heavier, the droplets pounding against the glass windows in a steady, cold rhythm, like an invisible warning. Hal sighed, trying to push the negative thoughts out of his mind. He knew he couldn't refuse this task. Tony had emphasized the store's rules, and Hal didn't want to lose the chance to earn a tip. Reluctantly, he put on his waterproof jacket, zipping it up to his neck to shield himself from the biting cold outside. He picked up the pizza box from the counter, the warmth from the box spreading through his chilled hands. As he stepped out of the store, Hal was immediately enveloped by the gloomy darkness and the relentless downpour. The town, already quiet, now felt even more isolated and eerie. The faint streetlights were insufficient to dispel the darkness, and the wet streets seemed to stretch endlessly. Hal hurried toward his car, the sense of unease growing stronger with every step. He opened the car door, placed the pizza box on the passenger seat, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared softly to life, but the sound did little to dispel the cold atmosphere around him. Hal glanced at the piece of paper with the address again, trying to visualize the route he would take. But the more he looked, the more it felt like this address didn't belong to anywhere in reality. It seemed like a name conjured out of thin air, a place that didn't exist. Hal took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "It's just a delivery," he told himself, his voice echoing in the cramped space of the car. Deliver the pizza, get the tip, and go home. But no matter how much he tried, the anxiety clung to him like a shadow he couldn't shake off. Hal drove out of the parking lot, the tires crunching against the wet pavement. Outside, the rain continued to pour, enveloping everything in a cold, watery veil. The streets were deserted, not a soul in sight, only the faint glow of streetlights and the bare trees standing silently under the rain. Hal felt as though he was entering another world, one where everything was unfamiliar and filled with danger. The car rolled forward, carrying Hal and the pizza box deeper into the night. He didn't know that the road leading to this address would be unlike any road he had ever traveled before. And the place he was heading to wasn't just an ordinary new residential area. It was a place where the rules of reality no longer applied, where darkness and terror waited to consume anyone who dared to enter. Hal sat behind the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, where the dim headlights struggled to pierce through the dense darkness. The rain continued to pour relentlessly, droplets striking the windshield in a steady rhythm, like the cold, lifeless beats of a heart. The town, already desolate, now seemed terrifyingly isolated in the midst of the rain and darkness. The houses lining the streets stood silent, their windows dark like eyes, watching Hal, making him feel like an intruder in a world of deathly stillness. He glanced at the piece of paper with the address resting on the seat beside him, where the strange handwritten letters seemed to dance under the faint glow of the car's interior light. The old map Hal kept in his car couldn't help him locate Ash Grove Road, forcing him to rely entirely on the handwritten directions. But even those instructions were unclear, a series of vague turns and landmarks that seemed as though they had been written by someone who didn't truly know the way. Hal drove through familiar streets, but the farther he went, the more unfamiliar the surroundings became. The rows of trees along the road gradually disappeared, replaced by empty fields and low shrubs beaten down by the wind and rain. The air grew colder and colder, the chill seeping through his jacket and into his very bones, making him shiver. A sense of loneliness and unease weighed heavily on him, like an invisible hand squeezing his heart. After nearly half an hour of driving, Hal reached a fork in the road. He stopped the car and glanced at the directions on the paper again. "Turn left," he murmured, his voice weak in the cramped space of the car. Hal turned the wheel, and as the car entered the new road, he felt as though he had just crossed an invisible boundary. The air around him seemed to change, becoming oppressive and heavy, as if the darkness here was thicker and colder. The road led Hal to a large residential area, modern but completely unfamiliar. The houses were built in a minimalist style, with pristine white walls and large windows. The streetlights cast faint beams of light onto the wet pavement, creating long, hazy streaks. But what was strange was that the neighborhood was completely silent. There were no voices, no car engines, Not even the barking of dogs or the meowing of cats. It was like a frozen painting, where everything was suspended in time. Hal stopped the car, the unease in his chest growing stronger. These houses looked new, yet there were no signs of life. There were no lights on inside, no cars parked in front of the houses. They stood there, cold and isolated, like lifeless entities waiting for something. Hal looked around, trying to find any trace of life, but it was all in vain. He picked up the piece of paper with the address, and for the first time, he noticed something strange. There was no house number matching. 13 Ash Grove Road. The houses here were numbered in sequence, but the number 13 didn't exist. Hal felt as though he had stepped into a bizarre game where the usual rules no longer applied. The unease turned into a vague sense of fear. Hal took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "It's just a new residential area," he told himself. But his voice sounded like a lie. What he didn't know was that this place wasn't just an ordinary neighborhood. It was a gateway to something dangerous, ambiguous, and powerful, a presence waiting for him. Hal felt he couldn't keep driving in this state of uncertainty. The old map in his car was useless, and the handwritten directions on the piece of paper were becoming increasingly meaningless. Ash Grove Road remained a mystery, and the strange residential area he had just passed through only deepened the unease in his heart. When he saw the faint light from a gas station by the roadside, Hal decided to stop. Perhaps here, he would find some answers. The gas station stood alone in the darkness, its old neon lights casting a pale, cold glow. The raindrops on Hal's windshield reflected the light, creating distorted shapes, like ghosts dancing. Hal parked his car next to a gas pump, but there were no other vehicles around. The silence was so profound that he could hear the sound of his car engine cooling down. Hal stepped out of the car, pulling his jacket tightly around himself to ward off the biting cold. He looked around, trying to spot someone at the gas station. The glass door of the convenience store inside was coated with a layer of dust, and the light from within wasn't bright enough to illuminate everything clearly. Hal walked in, the small bell on the door ringing out, shattering the silence, but no one appeared. He stood in the middle of the store, a chilling sensation beginning to creep over him. The shelves were nearly empty, with only a few old scattered items left, as if the place had been abandoned for a long time. Hal was about to head back to his car when a voice spoke from behind him. "Need some help?" Hal jumped and turned around. A man was standing there, appearing as if from nowhere. He wore a wrinkled gas station uniform, but what caught Hal's attention the most was the man's smile. It didn't change, didn't seem natural, as if it were painted onto his face. The man's eyes were strange too, not reflecting any light, just two dark voids that made Hal feel as though he was being seen through entirely. I'm looking for Ash Grove," Hal said, his voice trembling. The man didn't reply immediately, just stared at Hal with the same unchanging smile. After a few seconds, he nodded as if he had just understood something. "Ash Grove? Ah, I know the way. Let me show you." He walked over to the counter, pulled out a piece of paper, and began sketching a simple map. His strokes were quick and precise, but something about them felt wrong. Hal looked closely at the map and realized it didn't resemble any route he had ever known. The turns, the landmarks, they were all unfamiliar, as if they belonged to another world. When the man handed the paper to Hal, the smile on his face still hadn't faded. "Just follow this route, and you'll get there," he said, his tone calm, but carrying an unnerving quality that sent chills down Hal's spine. "But remember, don't take a wrong turn. Everything there has its own rules." Hal felt a shiver run down his back. The man's words sounded like a vague warning, but he didn't dare ask further. Taking the paper, Hal thanked him reluctantly and headed back to his car. As he glanced in the rearview mirror, the man was still standing there, his unchanging smile fixed on Hal as he watched him leave. Hal started the car, but the feeling of unease didn't leave him. The piece of paper with the directions lay on the seat beside him, the strange lines seeming to shift under the dim light. He didn't know that from this point onward nothing would be the same. The gas station, the man, and his cryptic words all were signs of something greater, a supernatural force waiting for him at the end of his journey. Hal drove to the address written on the piece of paper, his heart filled with confusion and unease. The road leading to this place grew increasingly desolate, with barren trees standing silently on both sides, like ghosts guarding a secret no one dared to uncover. The cold air seeped through the cracks of the window, making Hal feel as if he were entering another world, a place shrouded in isolation and eeriness. His car slowed down as the house came into view. The house stood alone in the middle of a wide yard, surrounded by ancient trees with gnarled branches stretching out like hands emerging from the darkness. The faint light from the street lamp wasn't enough to fully illuminate the scene, but Hal could make out old cars parked in the yard. They weren't ordinary cars. Their paint was peeling, their wheels covered in dust and moss, yet they remained there, as if waiting for something. Hal felt something was off. These cars seemed like forgotten relics from another era, but their presence created an uncanny sensation, as though they were alive. Hal stepped out of the car, his legs feeling heavy as he approached the front door. The house had an antique charm, but not the warm kind people usually associate with old homes. The ivory white walls had yellowed with age. The small windows were tightly covered with thick curtains, and the steep roof gave the house an ominous appearance. Hal rang the doorbell, the sound echoing in the quiet, more like a warning than a typical signal. The door opened, and a woman appeared. She wore a long dress with a vintage style, her hair neatly tied in a bun. Her face showed a little emotion, but her bright eyes in the darkness made Hal feel as if he were being scrutinized. "You're Hal, aren't you?" she asked, her voice gentle but with something in it that sent a chill down his spine. Hal nodded, and she invited him in. Stepping inside, Hal immediately noticed the strangeness of the house. Everything was styled from the 1970s. From the brown leather sofas, the bulky TV set on a wooden stand, to the faded paintings on the walls. It all made Hal feel as though he had stepped into a time machine. The atmosphere inside the house was unusual as well. Not the biting cold from outside, but a stifling air, as if the space had been sealed off for a long time. Hal tried to stay calm, but the sense of alienation and unease grew stronger. The hostess led him into the living room, where the light from an old chandelier cast long shadows on the walls. "You've come at the right time," she said, her tone ambiguous. "Everything is ready." Hal didn't know what she was referring to, but he felt as though there was no turning back. This house, the strange woman, and the old cars in the yard all seemed to be part of a larger game, where the rules were unclear and everything carried a supernatural significance. Hal sat down in the chair she indicated, trying to conceal the anxiety bubbling inside him. But he didn't realize that from the moment he entered this house, he had become a part of it, a part of something dangerous and powerful, waiting just beyond. Hal sat on the old, worn-out sofa, its leather torn and exposing patches of foam inside. The air in the room was heavy, as if all sound had been drained away, leaving only the slow ticking of an antique wall clock. He tried not to focus on the growing unease in his chest, but his gaze unconsciously stopped on the photographs hanging on the opposite wall. They were neatly arranged in old wooden frames, but there was something strange about them that felt off. Hal stood up and walked closer for a better look. The photographs appeared to be family pictures, taken at various points in time. One showed a young couple standing in front of this very house. Another depicted a family of four smiling brightly beside an old car in the yard. But what sent chills down Hal's spine was the smiles. Everyone in the photographs, whether children or adults, had the exact same smile. A smile so wide, it looked unnatural, as if it had been painted onto their faces. Their eyes, instead of reflecting joy, were hollow and cold, like bottomless pits. Goosebumps rose all over Hal's body. He tried to calm himself, telling himself it was just a coincidence, or perhaps his perspective was making everything seem stranger than it really was. But as he scanned each photograph, the fear in his heart grew stronger. Something wasn't right. These pictures weren't just ordinary family photos. They felt like fragments of a story Hal didn't want to know the ending of. His eyes landed on the largest photograph, positioned in the center of the wall. It was a group photo showing over 10 people standing in front of this house, all dressed in 1970s style clothing. Their smiles were exactly the same as the others, but what terrified Hal was, in the corner of the photo, he recognized the woman who had greeted him. She stood there, looking exactly the same as she did now, without having aged a single day. Hal took a step back, feeling as though he had just seen something he wasn't supposed to. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The woman's voice rang out from behind him, making Hal jump. He turned around to see her standing there, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Our family loves taking photographs. Everyone has their own place in the story." "What? Story?" Hal asked, his voice hoarse with fear. She didn't answer right away, instead stepping closer to the central photo, her thin fingers lightly touching the glass. "Everyone has their role to play, and you, Hal, are no exception." The smile on her lips, identical to the ones in the photographs, made Hal feel as though he had been pulled into a game whose rules he didn't understand. Hal backed away, feeling as though the room was closing in on him, the air growing increasingly stifling. The photographs on the wall seemed to move, the hollow eyes in the images now appearing to watch him. He felt trapped, as if every escape route had been blocked by an invisible force. And in that moment, Hal realized that this house wasn't just a place. It was an entity, a supernatural being full of danger, and he had unknowingly stepped into its domain. Hal stood frozen in the middle of the living room, trying to calm himself after the strange conversation with the woman of the house. But the unease in his heart kept growing, like a shadow creeping into every corner of his mind. His eyes were unintentionally drawn to the old TV set in the corner of the room. The blurry screen emitted monotonous beeping sounds, and in front of it sat two children on the floor, engrossed in playing a video game. They looked about 8 or 9 years old, dressed in simple but outdated clothing, as if they had just stepped out of the 1970s. One was a boy, the other a girl. Both were silent, focused on the game, but their presence in this house made Hal feel that something was off. He didn't recall the woman mentioning children in the house. And why were they sitting there, in such a desolate space, without showing any discomfort or fear? Hal took a deep breath and moved closer to observe. But as he took a single step forward, both children simultaneously stopped playing, as if they had sensed his presence. They turned their heads, and Hal froze instantly. The smile, that smile. Their smiles were identical to the ones in the photographs, on the wall so wide it was unnatural, their lips stretched taut as if carved onto their faces. And their eyes held no life, only a cold, dark void like bottomless pits. Hal felt his heart pounding, each beat echoing in his head like an alarm bell. He took a step back, but the children's gazes remained fixed on him, unblinking. "Do you want to play with us?" the girl asked, her voice soft but strangely resonant, as if it didn't come from her mouth but from somewhere far away. Hal didn't answer, standing there, trying not to let his fear show. But the boy spoke next, his voice carrying the same eerie tone. "You'll like this game. Everyone does." Hal felt a chill run through his body, as if his blood had turned to ice. He couldn't take his eyes off the children, but he knew he had to do something. Something was very wrong here. These children weren't children. They were part of something bigger, something dangerous. And this house was at the center of it. "No, thank you," Hal said, his voice trembling. He tried to stay calm, turned around, and quickly walked toward the door. But as he passed through the living room, he could feel the children's eyes following him, as if they were tracking his every move. A light, haunting giggle echoed behind him, sending shivers down his spine and forcing him to quicken his pace, nearly breaking into a run as he left the room. He reached the front door, but as his hand touched the doorknob, he felt it was ice cold, as though it had been frozen. Hal turned the knob, but it wouldn't budge. He turned back and saw the woman standing at the end of the hallway, her smile identical to the children's and the ones in the photographs on the wall. "You've met them, haven't you?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with an unsettling mystery. "The children love having visitors." Hal didn't respond, focusing instead on trying to open the door by any means. Finally, the door gave way, and he burst outside, not daring to look back. The cold air outside bit at his skin, but at least it wasn't as oppressive and terrifying as the atmosphere inside the house. Hal ran to his car, started it, and sped away, leaving behind the house, the photographs, and the strange children. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the silhouettes of the two children standing at the front door, still watching him, their smiles unchanged. And in that moment, Hal realized that even though he had left the house, he hadn't truly escaped it. A part of it had latched onto him, and perhaps he would never be free. Hal sat silently on the sofa, trying to control the rapid breaths pounding in his chest. What had just happened with the two children left him unable to shake off the sense of unease. The air in the house had now grown even colder, as if all warmth had been drained away, leaving only isolation and dread. He looked around, trying to find something normal to cling to, but everything in this room radiated a sense of mystery, something that just didn't feel right. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Hal looked up, and in the dim light, he saw the woman of the house entering, accompanied by a man. The man was tall, with gray hair and dressed in an old, worn suit. But what froze Hal in place wasn't the man's appearance, it was his smile. That smile so unnaturally wide, identical to the ones in the photographs on the wall and the two children he had just encountered. His eyes, like the woman's, were empty and cold, like two bottomless pits. "We're so glad you came," the woman said, her voice soft but haunting. The man standing beside her said nothing, only staring at Hal, his smile unchanging. Hal felt as though he were hypnotized, the man's gaze pulling at his mind, dragging him into a dark, endless void. In that moment, Hal felt as though he had lost control of himself, as if he were being manipulated by some invisible force. But, thankfully, a small noise from the window startled him back to reality. Hal shook his head, trying to dispel the dazed feeling, then stood up, attempting to remain calm. "I think I should go," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I've finished my work." The woman looked at him, her strange smile still fixed on her face. "Yes, you've done very well. Here's your payment." She handed Hal a brown envelope, her thin, bony hands, making him feel as though he were receiving money from something inhuman. Hal took the envelope, but as he touched it, a chilling sensation ran down his spine, as if the envelope contained more than just money. "We hope you'll come back," the man finally spoke, his voice deep and resonant, as though it came from somewhere far away. Hal didn't reply, only nodding mechanically before turning and walking quickly toward the door. He could feel their gazes still fixed on him, like invisible hooks clinging to his body. As Hal stepped out the door, he felt as though he had escaped a trap. The air outside was cold, but at least it wasn't as suffocating as inside the house. He hurried to his car, opened the door, and sat in the driver's seat. But before starting the engine, he glanced back at the house through the rearview mirror. The woman, the man, and the 2 children were all standing at the doorway, staring at him. Their smiles remained unchanged, as if they were seeing him off or waiting for something. Hal started the car and sped away, trying not to look back. But the sense of unease clung to him, as though he hadn't truly escaped that house. A part of it had latched onto him, and Hal knew that this encounter wouldn't end so easily. The house, that family, and their mysterious rules, all of it was part of something larger, more dangerous, and far more powerful. Hal could only hope that he would never have to return to that place. But deep down, he knew that might not be within his control. Hal bolted out of the house, his heart pounding, fear and unease enveloping his entire being. The air outside was freezing, but it was no more comforting than the air inside. He ran toward his car, but as soon as he stepped out of the gate, he froze. His eyes widened, and his breath caught in his throat at the sight before him. All the residents in the area, from the elderly to the young, were standing outside, lined up across the small road leading out of the neighborhood. They stood motionless, but all of them had their eyes fixed on Hal. The smile. That smile. Every single one of them bore the same strange, distorted, unnatural smile, identical to the family in the house he had just left. Their eyes, dark and empty like bottomless pits, made Hal feel as though he were being drawn into another world, one where normal rules no longer applied. Hal tried to steady himself and walked quickly toward his car. But just as he touched the car door, he heard a sound. Footsteps. At first, it was only a few, but it quickly grew into a thunderous noise, as if the entire neighborhood had begun to move. Hal turned his head and his heart felt as if it would leap out of his chest. All the residents, with those terrifying smiles on their faces, were moving toward him. No, they weren't just walking, they were running, their steps rapid and forceful, as if they were not human but predatory creatures. Hal hurriedly opened the car door, jumped inside, and locked it. He started the engine, but his trembling hands made it hard to control. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder and closer, and when he looked through the windows, he saw the distorted faces pressed against the car, their unblinking eyes staring straight at him. Some of them began pounding on the windows, the sound echoing like powerful punches, driving Hal into further panic. At last, the engine roared to life, and Hal slammed on the gas. The car shot forward, leaving the residents behind. But when he glanced into the rearview mirror, he saw that they hadn't stopped. They were still chasing him, undeterred by the car's speed. Their legs moved at an inhuman pace, as if they were not bound by the laws of physics. Hal pressed the gas pedal harder, the car shaking violently as he sped over the uneven roads, but the residents stayed close, never slowing down. Hal felt as though he were being hunted by a pack of wild animals. But what terrified him more was that these wild animals were people. Or at least, they had once been people. He didn't know what they were, but it was clear they didn't belong to the normal world. His breathing became labored, and despair began to creep into his mind. The road ahead seemed endless, and the figures of the residents remained visible in the rearview mirror, like ghosts relentlessly pursuing him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Hal saw a light at the end of the road. It was the exit out of the area. He floored the gas pedal, the car hurtling forward at maximum speed, and as he crossed the boundary of the neighborhood, the sound of footsteps behind him abruptly stopped. Hal looked into the rearview mirror and saw the residents standing motionless at the boundary, not taking another step forward. They just stood there, watching him, their distorted smiles still plastered on their faces. Hal kept driving, not daring to stop. He didn't know what he had escaped from, but he knew that those things didn't belong to this world. The air outside was still cold, but at least it no longer carried the oppressive dread of that neighborhood. Hal took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but the fear inside him had yet to subside. He knew that this escape wasn't the end, and that those entities might come for him again. Hal walked into the police station, his legs trembling, and his body still gripped by the chilling, eerie sensation from his escape. The atmosphere here was brighter, but he still felt as though an invisible shadow was clinging to him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself before approaching the reception desk. The officer on duty looked up, eyeing Hal with curiosity as he noticed his pale face and vacant eyes, as if he had just awakened from a nightmare. "How can I help you?" the officer asked, his voice calm but tinged with a hint of skepticism. Hal tried to compose his thoughts, then began recounting the entire story. From the moment he accepted the delivery job, entered the strange house, encountered the family with their distorted smiles, to the terrifying escape from the abnormal residents. He recounted everything in detail, leaving nothing out, but the more he spoke, the more he noticed the officer's expression shifting from curiosity to doubt. No matter how truthful his words were, they sounded like a far-fetched tale. "You're saying the entire neighborhood chased after you?" the officer asked, his tone laced with a hint of mockery. "And they had strange smiles?" "Yes," Hal nodded repeatedly, his voice growing desperate. "They weren't human. I don't know what they were, but they were definitely not normal. You have to believe me." The officer sighed, looking at Hal with a mix of pity and skepticism. "We'll investigate, but maybe you were mistaken or imagined something. Are you sure you didn't drink anything before going to work?" Hal shook his head vigorously, feeling a wave of despair as he realized he wasn't being believed. But there was nothing else he could do but wait. A team of officers was dispatched to investigate based on his account. Hal sat in the waiting room, filled with anxiety but holding on to a faint hope that they would find something to prove he wasn't crazy. Hours later, the team returned. The captain walked in, his face serious but showing no signs of surprise or alarm. "We checked the area you described," he said, "but there's nothing there, just a dead-end road. No house, no neighborhood, no sign of anything you mentioned." Hal felt as though the ground beneath him had collapsed. He shot to his feet, his voice trembling with panic. "That's impossible. I was there. I saw them. You have to believe me." The captain shook his head, his eyes filled with both sympathy and firmness. "We didn't find anything, sir. Perhaps you were mistaken or influenced by something. I suggest you take some rest." Hal couldn't say another word. He just stood there, overwhelmed by a sense of isolation and despair. He left the police station, stepping out onto the street, but the world around him now felt alien. Everything looked normal, but deep inside, Hal knew he had encountered something beyond human understanding. Sitting in his car, Hal stared at his hands, where he could still feel the icy sensation from the envelope of money the lady of the house had given him. He opened it, but inside were only blank sheets of paper, worthless. A shiver ran down his spine. What he had experienced couldn't be explained by logic, and the fact that no one believed him only made it more terrifying. Hal started the car and drove off in silence. He knew he had encountered something that didn't belong to this world, a supernatural entity of immense power that he couldn't comprehend. And even though he had escaped it, he could feel that it was still out there, waiting. A part of that darkness had latched onto him, and Hal wasn't sure if he could ever truly escape it. Hal decided to quit his job the very next day. He couldn't continue his delivery work after what he had experienced. Every time he thought about that neighborhood, the distorted smiles, and the hollow eyes of the residents, a chill ran down his spine. He knew he had been lucky to escape something abnormal, but the feeling of unease still lingered. Even though he had left that area behind, Hal couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching him, an invisible shadow he couldn't escape. Hal tried to find a new job, but it wasn't easy. Not only did he have to deal with the fears stemming from his horrifying memories, but he also had to endure the skeptical looks of those around him. When he recounted his story to friends or family, it was dismissed as absurd or a product of his imagination. Even the police didn't believe him, which made Hal feel more isolated than ever. He began avoiding any mention of the incident, trying to bury it in the past, but it continued to haunt him in his nightmares every night. One day, in an effort to free himself from the torment, Hal decided to post his story online. He didn't expect to be believed, but he hoped that at least his warning would reach someone who might encounter the same thing. Hal wrote his post with utmost sincerity, detailing the mysterious neighborhood, the residents with terrifying smiles, and his harrowing escape. He described how the police found nothing, as though the area had never existed. "This is not a story for entertainment," Hal wrote at the end of his post. "I don't need you to believe me. But if one day you're offered a job that takes you to a strange neighborhood where the air feels cold and everything seems off, leave immediately. Don't go in. Don't try to investigate. Don't let your curiosity lead you to your death." Hal's post quickly went viral, but the reactions from readers varied. Some called him a liar, claiming it was just a fictional story to gain attention. Others were curious and wanted to find the area Hal had described to verify it, but there were also those who believed him, or at least felt frightened by his warning. A few people shared that they had experienced similar events places that didn't exist on maps, vague and dangerous supernatural entities. Hal didn't care whether people believed him or not. The only thing he wanted was for his warning to spread. He knew he had encountered something beyond human understanding, a supernatural entity of immense power and danger, and he also knew it wasn't confined to just one place. Such areas, such entities could be lurking anywhere, ready to consume anyone who unknowingly stepped in. From then on, Hal lived a quiet life, trying to stay far away from anything related to that horrifying event. But deep inside, the fear remained, like a scar that wouldn't heal. He didn't know if he had truly escaped it or if one day it would come for him again, but he knew one thing for sure. If he ever came across a place like that again, he would never set foot inside. And he hoped others would do the same.